Hello everyone, and welcome to the second AI talk at ETUI of 2025. My name is Aida Ponce del Castillo, your host, and I'm following closely the evolving landscape of AI and its impacts. Today I have a very special guest, Professor Juan Carlos De Martin. He is a full professor at the Department of the Polytechnic University of Polytechnic of Turin, Polytechnic University of Turin, and he also co-founded and co-directs the Nexa Center of Internet and Society. Since 2011, Professor De Martin is a Berkman faculty fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society of the Harvard University. He's also senior visiting researcher at the Internet and Society Laboratory of Keio University in Tokyo. Juan Carlos De Martin is also a columnist in the Italian newspaper La Stampa on issues related to digital technologies and their impact on society. And today, he will kick out our session with a critical overview of generative AI. Please, Juan Carlos De Martin, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak in this context. So thank you for inviting me. Now, I want to provide in a way that should be accessible for all sorts of listeners the context and the reason why we're talking about generative AI so much in the last couple of years, now 2 years and a half. First of all, I would like to say a few words about the term artificial intelligence. It's a term that has been widely criticized and also widely embraced. Criticized because it's an artificial expression that has been coined in 1955 especially by one of the pioneers of this discipline within computer science. His name was John McCarthy. And in 1955, for the first time, together with other researchers that at the time were young and they were on the way to become very famous, like for instance Marvin Minsky, they choose the expression artificial intelligence that has been with us now for almost 80 years. First of all, because it was sounded good. So it was we could say it was a marketing expression. It is a marketing expression because it uses a word that has no agreed meaning like intelligence, because as we know, there are many different ways in which we can define intelligence, and actually there are several concurrent potential meanings of the word. But this was chosen by John McCarthy and his colleagues because they wanted to break apart from the existing discipline that was addressing the same issues that artificial intelligence wanted to address, which was cybernetics. Cybernetics started in the 40s. It was strongly associated to mathematics and professor at MIT, Norbert Wiener. And for a number of reasons in 1955, John McCarthy and others wanted to break away from this interdisciplinary discipline that was cybernetics and from the specific figure of Norbert Wiener, who was a pacifist and who was also deemed suspicious in those years that were characterized by another McCarthy, Senator McCarthy, and the McCarthy era of the US. And so these people wanted to break away from cybernetics, and they wanted to look for funding. And actually the word intelligence has a connotation in English that doesn't have, for instance, in Italian. Italian is intelligenza. In English, as we know, intelligence also has another connotation, which is intelligence in the sense of secret services and the gathering of intelligence. So in a cold era, like in the 50s, going and looking for funding, typically from the federal government, with something that was dubbed intelligence, and also this added benefit. And from the very beginning, artificial intelligence was characterized by hyperbolic promises. So if you look, if you read the first this draft proposal that was written in the 1955 by McCarthy and others, you could read that if computers, if properly programmed, that's what they were writing, they could do things like translate from one language to another, like for instance from Russian to English, and they could understand natural language. So all sorts of objectives that were described as just a few years away if given proper funding, and we now know that actually it took several decades in order to start to reach those promises. But now today we also have another set of hyperbolic promises attached to the current brand or incarnation of artificial intelligence. Now, for several decades, and this is important to underline, artificial intelligence followed an approach that we could say was based on logic. It was a deductive approach. So essentially, for decades, the laboratories and the people involved in this subfield of computer science, they tried to model the way they thought the human brain would actually reason. And so they try to create models and try to embed knowledge within these models. Like, for instance, define concepts in a clear way, and then define the relationship between concepts so that you had a very large network of concepts connected by relationship. So then you could apply a deductive engine and derive new knowledge from this representation of the existing knowledge. Like, for instance, a chair is something with typically four legs and therefore, etc., etc. Okay. Now, this deductive approach went on until the 1980s. In the 1980s, it was the approach that was tried at the time with limited success was embedding knowledge in expert systems that were for some time used and then later abandoned. But while this approach to artificial intelligence, or this deductive logic approach to artificial intelligence was going on, other things were happening in parallel. First of all, semiconductors started to increase their power exponentially. So the so-called Moore's law that was coined in 1969, and it was a forecast. Of course, it was not an actual law, but it was a forecast by one of the founders of the semiconductor industry that semiconductors would increase the number of transistors at essentially the same cost every year. Then it would become 18 months, and then 2 years. And I mentioned this because one thing that was happening in the meantime, as the artificial intelligence researchers were following the logic modeling approach, was that computational power was increasing, and it was increasing exponentially. The second thing that was going on, especially from the middle of the 1990s, especially from 1996, when the internet was completely open to commercial exploitation, in that moment, the internet, which is a network that is characterized by very little privacy, so it's very easy to collect data on what the people using the internet actually do. In that moment, the US government, we're talking about the Clinton administration, essentially said that it was okay for private entities to collect a vast amount of data, or data of the people acting on the internet, of the customers or potential customers, vastly more than what the government could do. Then later on, we would see with Edward Snowden actually the collaboration between private entities and governments. And the second decision that was made at the time was that it was okay that advertising was the business model for internet web-based entities. So with this, the double original sin, as Meredith Whittaker calls it, we have the beginning of a second important trend that you should keep in mind in parallel with the constant increase in computational power, which is the huge collection of data on the individuals and their behavior. So with the widespread adoption of the web or the internet by then millions, then hundreds of millions, and by billions of people at the end of the last century and beginning of the centuries, at the same time, we have to imagine these huge quantities of data that are being collected. It is the time when entities from Silicon Valley and then the rest of the world are talking about big data for a reason. Okay. With the beginning of this century, of the 21st century, we have the emergence at the beginning subdued and then more and more evident of these huge companies, the so-called big tech or GAFAM, that start to become increasingly powerful, rich, and with their trove of data, whether it's search data, whether it's web navigation data, etc., increasing in their disk and in their servers. Okay. If you allow me for a second, I would say that at the beginning of this century, we could say that it really kicked into action in a big way a process which we could call the computerization of the world. Computers at the beginning, 1950s, 1960s, were not so common. They were big, expensive, difficult to program. Then with the 1970s, we have the personal computer, and computers still clearly identifiable as computers start to become much more common. But it's with the beginning of the century that the number of computers, large, powerful computers or tiny computers, typically connected to the internet, really become widespread throughout society, throughout spaces, in our objects, in our pockets, everywhere. And so I invite you to think about artificial intelligence as one additional strand of an overall process that the historians of the future will probably identify as one of the main characteristics of this first quarter of the century, where computers proliferated everywhere. People are computerized, and they're typically computerized because they carry a hyper-personal computer, which is a smartphone, which collects huge amount of data on them and the environment in which they are. The world is computerized because objects are computerized, and therefore we have cars which are becoming more and more computers with 4 wheels and an engine, and appliances are computerized, televisions are computerized, even our traditional appliances like refrigerators or the doorbell or thermostat are computerized, and spaces are computerized. So we used to talk a lot about smart cities, but smart cities are just another way of saying that the city, urban spaces are computerized by sensors, by smart cameras, and by computers. So the computerization of the world is more than 4 billion people with a hyper-personal computer, which is a smartphone, more and more private and public spaces which are surveyed by smart cameras and by sensors, and more objects in private spaces, in companies, and also in the home of people, also in publics, in the streets and the squares, which they change their nature because of the presence of computers. All of this is one of the main reasons of why the world is being computerized is actually to produce data. To produce data which ends typically in the disk and in the servers of a handful of companies that I already mentioned. So one last word that I want to say about the computerization of the world is that the computerization of the world of the last quarter century has been deployed, at least in North America and in Europe, in a highly centralized fashion. It was not necessarily so. A long time ago, we used to talk about distributed computing, peer-to-peer, collaborative computing, so that it could have been different, and it could be different going forward, but it's a fact that up to now has been done in a highly centralized fashion, okay? And by the way, the computerization of the world in a highly centralized fashion has also meant that a number of countries, including European countries, have essentially more and more outsourced three crucial infrastructures. We could say three crucial infrastructure of independence or of sovereignty, if you like, if you prefer the word. The three crucial infrastructures are the infrastructures of transmission of information, of archival of information, and of processing of information, of which artificial intelligence is now a new way of processing information. These three crucial infrastructure has been more and more outsourced to the above mentioned big US-based companies. Okay, which is quite interestingly surprising because for a long time it was crucial that any political entity that did not control also physically the infrastructures of transmission, archival, and processing of information had clear limitations to its independence. Now, going back to our main topic. So we have computational power that keeps increasing and increasing and increasing, and is increasingly in the hand of a few large corporations. We have data, so data that is produced, again, exponentially, and is produced because we have computerized the world, and so we have increased exponentially the number of points of production of data. That typically regards human behavior because that's where the value actually is, but also machines, machine tools, automobiles, vehicles, urban spaces, and so on. I remind you that before talking so much about artificial intelligence, the expression that was at the center of seminar like this one and conferences and university courses was big data, okay, for this reason. And then in 2012, something happens because secondary approach to artificial intelligence that has been going on almost from the very beginning, but was somehow considered less promising than the mainstream approach that was based on modeling and deductive powers. A different approach suddenly started producing very interesting results in the specific field of object recognition within images. The now Nobel Prize Geoffrey Hinton was one of the researchers that has been faithful to this secondary approach to artificial intelligence. It's an approach that now has become absolutely the new mainstream, even though the old symbolic logic approach is still present. But the mainstream is definitely this new approach that is based on two characteristics. The first characteristic is a faith in the hope that good results could be approached by imitating the physiology of the human brain. And the human brain is composed by billions of a certain specific kind of highly complex cells named neurons. And so neurons were already modeled in the 1940s as a very simple on-off switch machine. And this idea that putting together a high number of neurons, of course, the computer modeling of a neuron, a high number of them, highly interconnected, could replicate, if properly connected and programmed, could replicate the cognitive powers of the human brain. So we know now that the human brain is incredibly sophisticated. The neurons, even a single neuron, is incredibly more complex than scientists used to think 70, 60, 50 years ago. Nonetheless, this approach of trying to replicate the supposed physiology of the brain in the hope that it could produce results remain alive. And in 2012, crossed the other currents that I mentioned before, crossed the current of increasing computational power, crossed the movement to have a huge amount of data available. And therefore, it became attractive to try to do intelligent tasks like recognizing the presence of an animal, of a cat in an image, with an approach which we could call of brute force. A brute force approach, not an elegant, deductive engine, but a brute force approach where I can use the muscles of huge computational power, and I can use the huge troves of data available in many different areas of human activity and also of machine activity, trying to to produce good results. When I say brute force, it's not my coin. I didn't invent this expression. It was a technical expression, and I can bring my own experience because I used to work also for a US company in the 1990s in the field of speech coding. Mostly for telephony uses. Now, for a long time, researchers used to model the speech production apparatus of the human body. So going from the vocal cords and then the vocal tract and the tongue, etc. And for decades, the approach was modeling. If we had a good enough model, we could produce and represent digitally voice in a very compact way to do wireless transmission or transmission of the internet or satellite communication. Well, in the 1980s and then in the 1990s, a brute force approach with elements of the models proved to be surprisingly successful. So throw a lot of computational power to the problem, and you could actually represent the human voice without losing too much time trying to model this messy, complicated apparatus of phonetic production. Okay, and out of that came the GSM standard for digital cellular telephony that we are still using today. Okay. Now, back to our topic, neural networks. Neural networks now with a huge number of nodes that can be, each node can be associated with weights, huge amount of data. Therefore, the approach that proved successful in 2012 and which started this new attention and also this gold rush to artificial intelligence was that this approach started to prove surprisingly effective. Surprisingly effective, for instance, in one of the crucial area of artificial intelligence, which is, for instance, speech recognition. So natural speech. It has been tried from the beginning, from the very beginning of computing, so almost for 80 years now. And also with models, then with statistical models, and now this brute force approach in the 2015, 16, 17, 18 started to produce actually really good result. And so people started actually using software to dictate a text which has been tried for decades, but with good enough results. Okay. And so we get to the point of the last few years. So the so-called large language models, LLMs, chatbots like ChatGPT. What happens? What we are talking about? Well, we are talking about super sophisticated statistical machines that have explored and extracted statistical correlations by huge amount of language. So all the language available on the internet, language available in books that have been digitized and the text has been recognized, etc., etc. So we have to think of large language models as a very sophisticated statistical engine that can explore a multidimensional space. Each word can be seen as characterized as a point in a space that the dimension of the space is upwards of 12,000 dimension. And by exploiting the correlation among words and trying to find out what is the best, quote unquote, sequence of words in response to the famous prompts that we give to these services, it produces amazingly surprising, sensible answers. Not always, because as we all know, they can make up non-existent references, they can make very silly and mistakes, they can provide dangerous replies, all sorts of other limitations, but surprisingly better, much better than whatever had been tried before. So When we look at generative AI, and I'm focusing on specifically on language, but of course it has been applied, as you know, also on images and videos and all sorts of other domains. When we look at this surprisingly successful services, we should keep in mind not only their obvious success and also their potential usefulness even right now, but also their limits. Because of course the proponents of the services, as it is natural, they underline the sometimes hyperbolic features, but we have to keep in mind at the same time the limitations. The limitations are the following in my view. First of all, intrinsic limitations. It's a statistical engine, super sophisticated, like nothing has been tried before of this sophistication and power. However, it's a statistical model. It's a machine producing something on which we project, we anthropomorphize them, we project humanity on them. And therefore, the one limitation is that this machine is not alive, has no actual knowledge itself, has no experience of life, has no experience of death, no experience of emotions, and therefore we should be always very careful when we use it to keep in mind that it's a machine. I think it's a useful mental experiment to think that the text coming out of something like ChatGPT is coming out of a toaster. Second aspect that has been now discussed for the past year or so, the environmental cost. There was already a lot of research and debate regarding the environmental cost of the computerization of the world that I described before. But now with this kind of approach to artificial intelligence, this kind of a brute force approach to artificial intelligence, the cost regarding the consumption of land for the huge data farms and server farms, of course, of energy. We are talking about bringing back into commission nuclear power plants, dismissed coal plants, or to produce from scratch power plants specifically to power the services. The use of water, huge amount of water in order to cool the machines, which is, of course, in a period in history in which we talk about climate change, of course, has to be kept in mind. It's just a quick observation. When this is brought up to the attention of the people leading these companies, one answer was, well, it's a good use of energy and land and water because artificial intelligence will help us to find the solution to climate change. Okay, and I only mentioned that, in my opinion, we're in the realm of religion, not in the realm of rationality when these statements are made. There are labor issues. So, as many researchers like Antonio Casilli, Milagro Miceli, and others have shown, there is the hidden labor of millions of people, typically in poorer countries with poor working conditions and poor wages, that enable these hyperbolic algorithms to work, and therefore this has to be kept in mind whenever this artificial intelligence is brought about, saying that it's not only artificial, it's also very human in this sense. And dependency from a US company, I already mentioned this point, but the moment when we are asked in universities, in schools, in governments, in companies to give a more and more central role to these services, we have to keep in mind that we are giving even more leverage on these companies, which already have a lot of leverage, especially in Europe. And therefore, it's a sort of dependence, which is not only an economic issue, it's also more than economic. I would say it is a strategic issue. And finally, last point is that we have to think about the potential uses, not only the potential positive uses, for instance, in medicine, to find out on new molecules for medicines and many other potentially useful applications of these new technologies. But also we keep in mind that this technology can produce sensible, intelligent sounding text that can be tailored to specific individuals. And this, of course, could be used to introduce even more, how can I call them, disturbances in the public sphere, because it can produce a huge amount of content in a very personalized fashion that was not possible before. And therefore, this could be a problem when we are seeking for a healthy public debate on whatever issue. And finally, last point is that this technique can be used to even increase the level of surveillance, because they can produce synthetic reports on individuals that can be maybe containing dangerous mistakes, potentially even lethal mistakes when these algorithms are used in the defense area or during war, but more generally surveillance. So we already have large digital dossiers regarding each of us, and now we can have algorithms that can produce a one-page report on our preferences, our political orientation, and that can be used, of course, against our own interests and our rights. Okay, I see that my time has allotted time has expired. Therefore, I will stop here and give the microphone and the floor back to you.
Thank you so much, Juan Carlos, for this absolutely illuminating talk. It has been fantastic. I have two questions before we open the floor to our audience who are waiting in the lobby. I would like to invite you to write your questions in the chat so we can address them in the following moments. So the first question, Juan Carlos, so this is the present of generative AI. And as we can see, every day we almost have a new version of ChatGPTs or the Claudes or the Gemini's versions that are coming all the time. I would like to have a look at the future. If the context, if the computational context is the one that we see today, how do you see it in 10 years?
Well, it's such a fast-moving area that it is very difficult to look ahead. But of course, we have to look with attention to the novelty represented by DeepSeek, so this Chinese offer. Why do I say that? Because this new service coming from China has proved to be to produce very interesting results with less resources. So with significantly less resources than the traditional brute force approach that I was talking about. And also they released one version of their engine for public use. So anybody could have downloaded on their own machine. Since it requires less resources, it can be run even on a personal computer. And this has the potential to democratize a technology that up to that moment seemed to be inexorably in the hand of a handful of companies. So I think this is, I'm very eager to see what happens as a consequence of this innovation.
All right, and my second one is related to the actual use of these tools in our daily lives, especially at work. More and more institutions, including universities or schools, workplaces, research institutes, and any other company are really implementing and adopting and sometimes tailoring generative AI tools for their work. And workers or employees are being asked to use them with or without training. But in your experience, what is the potential risk, or I'll put it in another way, can we as users or as employees of a given company have really control of the outputs generated by these tools, or how can we have a more critical outlook to what is produced and generated?
Yes, it's an important question. Thank you. Well, first of all, we have to keep in mind that there is, as usual, with each new wave of computer technologies, there is a huge pressure to adopt them. So there is a lot of marketing, meaning that there is a lot of people who want to sell something, and therefore they underline the potential positive uses of this technology. It happened before for cloud computing, for web, for big data, for all of them. Now it's artificial intelligence. Like in all other cases, each institution and even each individual, it could be also a worker, should, if the worker has the freedom to do that, should ask more soberly what is actually new, what is actually can be done with this technology. So trying to weed off the marketing and the hype and to really identify the actual technical perimeter of what's really new and tangible. And actually, that this is something to which computer engineers and computer scientists like myself have also a responsibility to help the general public to understand in the fog of marketing what's actually really new. And then trying to assess as soberly as possible whether these tools can actually be useful to achieve our institutional aim in the case of school or universities, or the aim of a specific company in the case of companies. Why do I say that? Because, for instance, I come from an educational institution. There is, for a couple of years, a lot of talk about generative AI in the field of education. I also had the opportunity to interact with experts that are more expert in the field of schools, so elementary schools, secondary schools, and it's very interesting and also discomforting to see that there is a push to adopt these tools without questions. So they had to be they must be adopted in a sort of fear of missing out, we could say, without really saying, okay, but in the specific context of a classroom, I'm a teacher. I have certain educational objectives. I have specific human beings, minors in the case of schools, in front of me. How do I exactly envision to use these specific tools? Okay, and this is done surprisingly little. So schools are pressured, maybe by parents or by governments, to adopt this technology even before there is a clear case studies of actual use, and not to mention actual scientific results of the positive outcomes of the use of this technology. Okay, so what I would recommend, and I'm also thinking about my own institution, is not to accept this pressure critically, but just to study the issue and to as objectively as possible look at this technology, having no fear of saying no, we'll wait, or maybe no, this is not the right moment, we'll reconsider it when the technology will change. Okay. And let me mention one additional concern, which regards privacy, in the sense that, of course, exactly like in the case of search engines, but maybe even more so, when people ask questions, the so-called prompts, of course, they reveal something about themselves. They reveal their interest, they reveal maybe even their own personal, sensitive individual position, or maybe sensitive government or company data. And so it's also to be important to be aware of this privacy component of the interaction with these services.
Thank you for that. We have a lot of questions here that I would like to take. The first one, and a little bit more technical in a way, Karen Yips asks if you could please expand more on the relationship between AI infrastructure and nuclear power.
Oh, yes. I was referring to public statements by the leadership of big tech companies like Microsoft and others that have claimed that the huge need for energy for these data centers powering artificial intelligence services will require nuclear plants. So in the US, there was talk about reactivating the infamous 3 Mile Island nuclear plant on the eastern part of the United States, but also in Europe, there's talk about even creating from scratch new generation power plants in order to power these data centers. So that was the only reference.
All right, interesting. Going again, linking the US and the Chinese jurisdictions, Alfred Tichy asks, where are the differences between the different AIs in the use globally, like the US based, to the Chinese models?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the real difference has been, well, first of all, I didn't say it, but it's now a good time to say it. I was talking about big US companies. The only other country that can be compared in this domain is China. So China is its own models, its own companies, and rapidly expanding industrial base in artificial intelligence. And actually, very interesting from what I read, applications of artificial intelligence, very practical, pragmatic applications in many domains. But the real difference is now, in my view, represented by DeepSeek, in the sense that even though researchers and from Western companies, they claim that in reality the techniques used by DeepSeek are also used by OpenAI and others. So they claim that there is not such a real big difference from the technical point of view. Even though that's the case, still the use of much less resources and also making this at least one version of the model openly downloadable and usable, I think it records a difference. As if we could read it, I don't know if that's the case, but we could read it almost as a message from China saying that could be different, that artificial intelligence doesn't have to be concentrated in big, huge corporations, but it could also be more widespread.
Right, and I found a question about, yes, Uwe Meister. AI companies claim that their systems will get better and better over time, become almost flawless over time. The question is there a reason to believe that brute force systems, and the chat moved, I'm very sorry, so I cannot read it anymore. Apologies for this, the brute force system. So Uwe mentions, is there any reason to believe that brute force systems will ever get to a point where they are almost flawless in their answers, or will there always be a certain amount of error for the foreseeable future?
Yes, I think it's well. First of all, that the story of these last few years is that they have been improving. So they were launched to the public, especially ChatGPT, in November 2022, in a very abrupt fashion. Probably they wanted to be the first mover, the first player in the field. And so, as we all know, the first version of ChatGPT was very crude in the sense that it didn't take in consideration potential negative uses of the chat. So apparently nobody paid attention that it could be used by children, it could be used by people asking for medications, could be used by people asking for ways of committing suicide or committing murder. And very quickly, all these things have been addressed in order also to avoid regulation. So yes, we've seen a lot of improvements. It's likely then we're going to see even more improvements. But the point is, what do we mean by error? In the sense that these output are produced by machines. So if we can, very high level of abstraction, it's a machine producing an output, and a machine, as I was saying before, is a machine. It's not a human being. So it has no perception of the world. Has no knowledge in the sense in which we say I know something. They have no how can I say, perception of feelings. They don't know what it means to die. So when we say about error, yes, we're going to ask them very straightforward, rational questions that will probably provide better and better rational answers. But if we are looking for something that is fully human, then I don't see how this can happen. I'm not saying it's impossible, okay? I'm not saying that it's impossible to replicate somehow what happens at the biological level on a biological basis in human beings. We cannot rule out that. But for the time being, a pure brute force approach, I don't think in the foreseeable future can achieve that. But it's my own, I cannot prove it. It's my own personal position.
Right. And do you think that the precautionary principle has a role in artificial general intelligence if that ever comes?
Well, the precautionary principle, I think it's a very sane way of looking at technology. Has been advocated by the German philosopher Hans Jonas now decades ago, and I think it should be embraced in the sense that we don't have to rush to adopt this technology or any other technology. Okay, any technology can produce positive consequences for humanity or for the environment, and we're very, of course, open and eager to see that. At the same time, whenever there is the rational risk that a technology could produce adverse consequences for individuals, for society, or for the environment, we should apply the precautionary principle and just simply study the issue. I'm not saying rejecting it, but simply studying the issue. Okay. What we're seeing, especially in the field of digital technology, a sort of exceptionalism. Okay, because it's digital, because it's dubbed fashionably artificial intelligence, then we should rush to adopt it. Okay, if this is rational from the people who are looking to make a profit and maybe to speculate on that, I think that from the democratic point of view, we should, on the contrary, approach, follow a more objective and sober approach, applying the precautionary principle.
Interesting. Thank you for that. And in this logic of thinking before acting, do you think that there will be a kind of counter AI against the silicon-based big tech movement? Or put it in another way, another question asked, will European AI companies come into play into the future? Do they have a role?
Well, I think that before talking about artificial intelligence in Europe, sure, it's important to talk about that. And we also have very good scientists, very good ideas. But we have to keep in mind something that I mentioned quickly in my presentation, which is that the computer infrastructure of Europe, especially in the last 20 years, has been outsourced more and more to these large US-based companies. So data centers, sure, we have in Europe physical data centers of Meta, Google, Microsoft, etc., but we are simply hosting them. It's theirs in order to better serve European customers. Okay, the cables used to be owned and managed by national telecommunications operators in France, in Germany, in Italy, etc. More and more cables are physically owned, deployed and owned by these companies. So the physical infrastructure. And when we're talking about the ability to produce advanced chips like the one used to train the models for artificial intelligence, we all know that these chips are not anymore manufactured in Europe. They're mostly manufactured in Korea and in Taiwan. So I would always couple the concern about the role of Europe with artificial intelligence with an even greater concern about something less fashionable, but the more fundamental pillars of the digital infrastructure. So we have to have our own capabilities at the semiconductor level, operating system level, application level, data centers, cables, all of it. And this is not, it is unfortunately the position of Europe in these fields is weak.
I see. Weak. Well, okay. I hope that we will transform that into a more stronger position regarding the competitiveness plans that the European Commission has for the whole of the EU. But what's your opinion about non-centralized networks? Can they be a balance or counterpower?
Well, I mean, the computerization of the world that I was mentioning before tries to produce as much data as possible and then send this data to a few large actors that more and more own the entire infrastructure. We could, and I try to do that also in things that I write and that I describe. we could question each level of this computerization of the world, meaning that certain data should not be collected, period. Like, for instance, recently there has been researchers, colleague of computer scientists have studied several models of smart TVs, and they found out that these smart TVs, they take a screenshot every 3 seconds. They broadly characterize the content of the screenshots and send the information to third parties. So these kind of activities should simply be illegal, shouldn't be allowed, period. So that's the kind of data that should not be collected. Or, for instance, since we're talking about in this context, data regarding workers. Okay, so more and more we always talk about the panopticon, but more and more workers are in a panopticon. They're measured data in their working activities collected, but there is very little data on the other side, meaning that the worker, even collectively, have very little visibility on the other side of their counterparts. So in the case of working conditions, I know we discussed that also together, we could say certain kind of data should not be collected, period. So not only discussing about how to use the data. In some cases, the data should not exist. And then we should remember ourselves, I mentioned that very briefly, that centralized computer infrastructure is only one possibility. Another possibility is peer-to-peer distributed. So trying to make computers collaborate with each other, so each of them having a small amount of power rather than concentrating all this power in huge servers that are typically controlled by a single entity. So a different computerization of the world is imaginable, and in theory it's deployable. But the first step is to not to take things for granted and not to be, I see in Europe, I sense a lot of resignation, like, okay, now it's over, there's nothing we can do about it. No, there is always the possibility of changing course.
Right, I appreciate that line of thoughts. And going back to intrusive surveillance and data that should not be collective, period. Do you think that Europe can keep today the high regulation on data protection compared to the rest of the world? Anna from Sweden asks.
I think absolutely so, in the sense that in Europe, decades ago, there was started this process that led to the more comprehensive regulation in the world that also have been copied by other countries in many parts of the world. And I think it's an important feature, and we should ask how to make it stronger, like in the case of the smart TV that I mentioned before. We should be aware that this collection of personal data that now can go back in time decades. Okay, like in my case, I was in the US and I became an Amazon customer, I think in 1996. So now Amazon has 30 years of data on me. So this kind of data on single individuals, and my smartwatch, my smartphone, and everything else produces data on me over decades of the life of a person, is something that, of course, has never happened before in history. And again, applying a precautionary principle, we should ask ourselves, what in principle a malignant actor could do with this kind of data regarding workers, citizens, individuals, minors, sick people, etc., etc.
Coming back to the topic, Juan Carlos, of Europe's tools and sovereignty and regulations, Monty Al asks that we hear often that in terms of competition and innovation in the field of AI models, the EU is significantly lagging behind the US and China. However, when looking at competition and innovation in the field of AI applications that builds on models, the picture is more positive. Do you agree with this? And if so, where especially do you see that the EU could take the lead?
No, and the issue of application is actually very important. I was briefly mentioning before that based on what I read, because I'm in no way a China expert, but I see that there is a lot of attention in China in how to very pragmatically apply these tools, even in not very fashionable applications, like how to use them to make travel booking more effective, how to make certain machine tools or factories more effective. So I think that's definitely an area where Europe could be distinguish itself. However, if we do that, subscribing to the services of the US based companies, of course, will mean that yes, maybe we reap the profits of applying artificial intelligence cleverly in traditional European area of activities. But we know that there are a few providers that maybe not now, but in due time, they could exercise their oligopoly power, saying now you have become dependent on these services, and therefore very simply to increase the cost and reduce more and more whatever margin we had coming from the application of these services. So we have to be technologically independent too.
Right. In this technological independence, there is a space for investment. And Marie Hasten Teufel asks, what do you think of the race to invest? And will there be benefits for the working population out of these investments?
Well, the huge investments we hear about, so the hundreds of billions of the US and China. In Europe, as we know, it's the numbers are order of magnitude smaller. We have to take in consideration that in the case of the US, according to analysts, also in the banking industry, there is a component of hype and speculation. So it is a bubble, according to financial analysts. So we already seen some of that bubble to decrease when DeepSeek was announced. It could very well be that in the coming weeks or months, the bubble could decrease even more significantly. Some people talk about 40% decrease, which could be translate into huge numbers, of course. So we should try to separate the part of financial investments which are purely speculative and financial from the ones that are actually aimed at developing actual skills and products and services. So in the case of Europe, we should try to not to be blinded by these huge numbers of the bubble at Wall Street, but trying to say to think what do we need to develop this independence in this field from the technological point of view, and to apply it to areas of European activities that can be profitable for us. Regarding workers, I think a very good exercise, but allow me to say it, even though it's not my field in this sense, but it should be very productive to ask actual workers to explain them the potential benefit, the potential uses of these tools, and to ask them, do you see these tools as a way to improve your working conditions, to make your work less alienated, to make your working day less heavy? So to try to collect suggestions from actual workers in the field, saying how they could envision uses of artificial intelligence beneficial to them, okay, rather than beneficial to the counterpart.
Okay. Juan Carlos, I would like to liaise with other questions related to human labor.
Okay.
And perhaps, for example, Ben Ray here asks, data annotation and data labeling, some of the work that you have mentioned that Antonio Casilli has been doing. Data annotation companies are increasingly hiring higher skilled labor to provide this human feedback. Do you envisage a situation where many high skilled workers become data annotators in comparison to what the picture of what Antonio shows? So for example, a paralegal doesn't do a traditional paralegal work. Instead, they test and fix the data and the paralegal AI in a way.
No, it could be, but let's keep in mind that highly skilled people have already contributed in the sense that a lot of content produced by very highly skilled people and also artists has been used without asking for permission and without retribution for the training of these models. So in a sense, highly skilled people have already given something, but without getting anything in return. And so this is something I didn't mention during my presentation, but it's worth remembering that what we've witnessed in the last few years could be described as another enclosure of commons. So all the things that were available on the internet and widely available have been enclosed for private profit making. But thank you for the question. It could be that at least some parts of the annotation job could be made by highly skilled people to further improve the output of these services.
I would like to follow up with a question for a user with a long name and a number. It says, if I understand it, generative AI is largely based on currently existing knowledge, ideas, and opinions. Does this lead to a tendency to recreate and emphasize existing prejudices and oppression, for example, based on race, gender, and nationality?
Yes, this has been definitely something that has been exposed right away, in the sense that since the training has been done on existing knowledge, then the output, especially at the beginning where less safeguards were in place, the output produced existing biases, existing tendency to discrimination, etc. So this is a very well-known issue that has been they try to address it essentially by fixing and tuning the output, trying to put in guardrails to avoid this kind of reproduction of existing biases in the training data.
And do you think that algorithmic decision-making systems or algorithmic decision-making results can be democratically controlled, mainly at the level of the workplace, in companies or in workplaces where there's supposed to be a human under control of it, or in large corporations where multinationals have their companies in, for example, Europe, but the decisions are made in the US. What type of real algorithmic control can we have over these decisions, and can it be made democratically?
Well, quite simply, whenever there is something important at stake regarding a human being, the decision cannot be purely algorithmic. So it's a principle that has already been around in Europe for some time, also in the GDPR, if I remember correctly. So we should ask that all decisions that affect important parts, even just grading in school, but it could be promotions in a company, should be made by human beings that take responsibility for this decision. So these human beings, probably they will use some algorithmic tools to assist them in their decision, but in the end, the responsibility should be squarely attached to a human being that takes responsibility for the consequences of the decision.
Thank you. I would just like to take a couple of questions more that are in a different direction. For example, one related to synthetic data. What are the consequences and risks of using synthetic data instead, I suppose?
Yeah, synthetic data has been, there was a lot of interest, and still there is interest because, of course, good quality data is not available, or the existing data has the biases that we were talking about. However, with the synthetic data, what has been seen in some cases is that it does not produce good enough results. So if we use synthetic data for that in training, at least in some cases, is just not very useful. So it has some advantages because since it's synthetic, I know how it is produced and I know that it doesn't have certain negative features. But at the same time, it's at least for certain applications, it's not as good as real data.
All right. Another question about the technological disruptions or the technological revolutions is from Nick Scott. And he asks, is generative AI different to waves of technological disruption?
I'm not sure I understand. So is he asking whether...
Yes, specifically, it feels to me, he says, that adoption is being driven in a bottom-up way. and institutions often are totally unaware of the widespread use with their staff base.
Mhm.
How does that compare to other technological developments, and what impact does that have on agency and response to the technology?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's true that it's, at least in some areas, is used by the individuals, even in universities, before the institution has made an official position regarding these tools. I think it's natural in the sense that these services are available to the individuals very easily, because anybody can go to the website or download the app and have access to this information. It may create, at least in some cases, may create problems, because it is a de facto adoption of given tools without the guidelines and the thought that it should be done at the institutional level. I'll just give you an example. In the case of education, what about teachers who use these tools to grade the homework of students, which of course is a very tiresome and burden, and of course is a temptation to make the grading using these tools. It's easy to do. However, it's also humanly comprehensible why somebody is tempted to use these tools. However, is something that should be not allowed. So I think there is a possibility that in some cases the bottom-up adoption can actually go against the rights of students in this case, or compromise the institutional objective of the institution to which these workers belong.
Juan Carlos, I think we have covered most of the questions. There are more comments and other questions that are more or less interrelated, but I would like to close perhaps with a more overarching question related to the environment, the impact on the environment. You have pointed out at some of the consequences. Do you think that companies at the moment are looking or transforming their business models in order to become more sustainable? What is your feeling?
Oh, wow. This is asked in March 2025. It's a difficult question in the sense that in the last few months we have seen so many changes in the public discourse, and not only the public discourse, meaning that the green transition and the attention to climate change that was so mainstream until a few months ago is crumbling in front of our eyes, and for several reasons and for several forces. And so unfortunately, I'm quite skeptical, but this is my individual position as a citizen. I'm very skeptical that we're going to hear a lot more about green transitions and to take really care of the climate change, because what we're seeing, unfortunately, is something completely different. Seems that priority has been entirely changed almost overnight, and this is really depressing.
And to finish with a positive note, thank you very much for your fantastic talk and questions. You were very, very pedagogical, and you provided us with a very comprehensive view of what is it and what it is to use generative AI in our daily lives and our work. And with that, we come to the end of our webinar, AI Talk. Thank you, Juan Carlos.
Thank you.
Thanks to you, the audience, for your active participation and your questions. And this is the end of the chapter. Thank you very much. See you next time, and good afternoon. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.